Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined once again by Miguel Pereira.
Hi, Rory. How are you?
I'm good, Miguel. How are you?
In the middle of a cold, but yeah, getting better slightly and ready to enjoy our chat about Spanish football and a sort of football clubs and identities of Spanish football that are not really well known outside of Spain, even inside of Spain, I would say. So it will be a very interesting conversation.
Yes, absolutely. Of course, Miguel joining us again off the back of the episode that we recorded on Club Uniao Fabril and following up from his book, which was released last year called Bring Me That Horizon, A Journey to the Soul of Portuguese Football. In this episode, as Miguel mentioned, we're going to be talking about some of the fan-owned Phoenix clubs of Spain and this sort of cultural phenomenon called Pasión that can be linked to many of these clubs being founded as Phoenix clubs and being rebirthed from the ashes of their demise. But Miguel is also following up last year's book with a book that by the time this recording comes out will already have been released called Pasión, A Journey to the Soul of Spanish Football, which I'm really looking forward to because it's within the same vein as your last book, and I really enjoyed your last book. So there's going to be lots to love about this next edition. Before we kick things off, Miguel, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself? I know you've been on the show before, but if you want to just give a brief introduction.
Yeah, basically, I'm a football writer for the past, I would say, 15 years now. I've write books both in Portuguese and Spanish and now in English, like you mentioned, the Bring Me the Horizon release of last year. And also the Pasión is going to be out in a couple of days, weeks, depends on when you're hearing this podcast. So essentially, I'm a journalist by trade, and I'm a football lover, a football historian as well. I've watched thousands of football matches over the years, done a lot of traveling around to watch football matches in stadiums all around Europe. So essentially, football is my thing, and putting football in perspective in a more contextual, historical, social, economical, even cultural point of view, it's also very important to me because I enjoy the game like anyone else. The 90 minutes, you're just there suffering for a team that you support or just enjoying the moment. But at the same time, I believe that football is clearly the most important phenomena of the 20th century because it reflects all the changes we live in society, whether it's political, whether it's social, whether it's economic. And these books that I write usually are a reflection of that as well. The Bring Me That Horizon was like a mirror on what was the Portuguese society over the past 100 years through football. And Pasión does the same with a much bigger country, much more complex country, and a country with much more richer stories that is Spain.
It's a great way of putting it, actually. And this is why it's so good getting you on the podcast because our ideas and how we view the game kind of align quite a lot. And obviously, the perspective that you bring, having travelled around and written these books, is always brilliant. So thank you very much for joining us once again. And I suppose to give a bit of context to this episode, one of the reasons that we're doing it, as you said, football anywhere in the world is a phenomenon, and one of the phenomenons in Spain in the lower divisions is this phenomenon of fan-owned Phoenix clubs, and specifically clubs which have went bust and have been reformed by fan groups and have now almost established this. I don't want to go so far as say subculture, but there's certainly a really strong network of these smaller clubs in Spain which have met a pretty grisly end, normally to do with financial issues, and have been reformed by the fans because of their love for the club. And it comes back to this idea of a concept called Pasión, which when I first read about it, I likened to, at least in principle anyway, to the Portuguese cultural phenomenon of Saudade. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, Pasión is it's much complex. It's a very Mediterranean trait, I would say. I think all around Southern Europe, people are very passionate about anything at all. In the introduction of the book, for instance, I speak about how Spanish people rival by the type of beers they have. Every area of Spain have a different type of beer, so everyone thinks their beer is better than the other one. So if they travel inside of Spain, they don't drink beers that are not their own. So they're always trying to fight for that, and that's a reflection of how the country is. But in essence, is a reflection of how the Mediterranean is. People always have an opinion about everything, always think they are in the right, and they live everything with high intensity. And they really develop an emotional trait with everything. And football is perhaps the most beautiful and at the same time complex mirror of that identity. And that happens in Portugal, of course, but I think even in Italy, probably the country that reflects it the most in the world is Argentina. But of course, Argentina, as we know, is a mix of Spain and Italy. So that's you have a formula that's inevitable to develop a huge sense of passion. And Spain is obviously the country that has the most. They had it in bullfighting back in their days. They have in music, they have in cinema, they have in literature, and of course, they have in football. And at the same time, like you mentioned, there's a lot of subcultures emerging now around the football owned by supporters. Essentially, because people in the UK really don't realize it, but in both in Portugal and in Spain, when football clubs were originally formed back in the late 19th centuries and throughout the 20th century, every single football club in Portugal and Spain were owned by their own supporters, every single one.
Mm.
And they kind of created an identity around that, a sense of belonging that didn't exist otherwhere else. Probably in Germany, there's also that relationship as well, but not in Italy, where a lot of football clubs have been owned by entrepreneurs, not in France, and not in the UK, where people are used to connect with a football club, but they always have people running the show behind, getting the responsibility of being the owners or being the chairman or whatever, or the investors
It's
behind
true.
each project. But that didn't happen when we speak about Portugal or Spain. And essentially, in the case of Spain, it was a very popular trait because it also helped to create communities around football. It helped to develop in the smaller cities in the interior, for instance, or in the coastal cities in the north or in the Mediterranean, a sense of belonging through football. What happened is that at the end of the 1980s, almost every single football club in Spain was bankrupt because the money they spent to be competitive, and Spain, as we know, is probably the most competitive football nation in the continent. That had a cost, and the government at the time made it mandatory to every single football club in Spain to become a PLC, to become a private owned company, with four exceptions because of their political relevance. One being Real Madrid, of course, which is still owned by socios, by the club members. The other one being Barcelona as well. And also Atletico Bilbao and Osasuna were very important clubs in the northern part of Spain, and they are still run by their own club members. But every single other football club in Spain, in the football pyramid, was transformed in a PLC. And what that made is open the door to a series of very shady businessmen who took the opportunity to enter, probably sometimes buying the club by pennies because being bankrupt, most of them weren't worth much. And essentially, some had the plan to develop the club and invest in the club and compete, of course, but many of them just use it to get money out of it. And so in the 1990s, when that happened, it was in 1992, in the 30th of June of 1992, a couple of days after Denmark had done that fairy tale win against West Germany in the final of the Euros. So basically, the soul of Spanish football changed altogether. And at the beginning, I don't think supporters really understood the relevance of that because for a few years, almost every side that had been bought by an entrepreneur kind of worked. But then at the end of the 1990s and at the beginning of 2000s, most of them got relegated. And being relegated, the owners were not very interested in invest anymore because they didn't see any profit on it. So essentially, most of those clubs simply died out. And most of them was also from smaller cities, not from the city of Madrid, and not from Barcelona, not from Seville. Those clubs were relatively safe. But the ones from the middle to small size cities, where they didn't have a powerful local economy, they didn't have the ability to attract investors from the outside, and we're still in the world where the Russian oligarchs or the Middle East oligarchs hadn't arrived in European football, so they weren't attractive to basically anyone, and they eventually died. In the 2000s, more than 30 football clubs in Spain folded for bankruptcy. And many of those football clubs were the sole representative of their cities. And we're talking about cities with 30,000, 50,000, 100,000 people that simply stopped having a football club competing in the first three or four tiers of the football pyramid. So Spain is a country where people support or Real Madrid or Barcelona. We all know that they have a very nationwide base. The localism that we have in the UK, that we have in Germany, that we have in the Netherlands is not as visible as in south of Europe. And in Spain, people used to be from their local club and also from Real Madrid or Barcelona or even Atletico Madrid. When those clubs were folded, most of the people simply reverted to be just a Barcelona supporter, just a Real Madrid supporter. But many people started to fight back and started to get inspired by what was done already in the UK with the AFC Wimbledon project, with the FC United Manchester project. So that served as an inspiration. And throughout the late 2000s into the 2010s, most of those football clubs re-emerged with new names, new identities, but directly connected with those historical clubs that had disappeared in the past. And those are the football clubs that we're going to talk about. And most of them now playing the third and fourth tier. They are still away from the professional leagues. In Spain, there's only two fully professional leagues, the first and the second. But the third tier is kind of semi-professional, the fourth as well, and they are already competing at that level. And many people expect them one day to go up to at least the second tier and become fully professionalized, owned by fans, managed by fans, and recovering that lost identity of the cities that have lost their football soul 15 to 20 years ago.
That's what I find most interesting about it, is that the concentration of these clubs at the moment is based in the third and fourth divisions, you know what I mean? But for me, this is what brings it back to the idea of Pasión, is that, for our listeners who don't know, what obviously the literal translation is passion, and I'd like to think that you all know what being passionate means. But within the sense of a kind of cultural phenomenon similar to like Saudade in Portugal, where it's a deep sense of longing for where you've come from. Miguel, you pointed out, in Spain you have this kind of local rivalry or regional rivalry with the brands of beer. In Italy, it's like this idea of the bell tower representing your town or your locality. With Pasión, it's more about expressing an unbridled and almost sort of extravagant joy, support, and loyalty and flair as well for your football club. And I think by explaining it like that to anyone, it makes the most sense for Spanish football, because that's what Spanish football is. It's flair, it's enjoyment, it's extravagance, it's taking things to the extreme, whether that's in fan displays or player displays as well. But what I like about it most is that these fans have brought this idea of passion to their football clubs by refounding them from being in a position of, being defunct, which is incredible. And now they've created this subculture within the lower divisions of Spanish football, and they're all looking to make the same wave by going to the same place, which is either the second or the first tier. It's just absolutely incredible stuff. And it's the type of thing that a lot of people would be quite quick to write off as well. But a lot of these guys have serious ambitions, and they've put serious backing behind it as well, that proves they're not just talking a big game. I mean, obviously, one of the biggest examples that came into my head when you mentioned the sort of rogue owner side of things there was CF Reus. That was one of our earliest episodes. I think they officially stopped playing in 2015, 2016, but they didn't officially wind the company down until 2020, maybe 2021 or something like that. And obviously, that's skipping quite a fair bit ahead, but that's a really good example, because there was so much involved in that story. Barcelona were involved, the president of La Liga was involved, there was former players involved, and it was just a bit of a mess, to be completely honest with you. And none of them had the intentions of the club at heart. I do think there has been some form of Phoenix club for CF Race recreated, albeit I think they are in the amateur leagues, if not maybe just like a youth side or something like that. Just so we can go through a little bit of additional context, Miguel, obviously you mentioned this sort of financial crisis that engulfed football in Spain during the 1980s. And then obviously you got into the 90s when football clubs were really being bought up and money was being thrown into the game. But for 34 clubs to go defunct within Spain, within that kind of period between the 90s and 2010, that's a huge number of clubs. Was there any specific reason for it, or was it just the case that money was being thrown at clubs that was completely unsustainable, and people were asset stripping the teams to basically put as much in their pockets as they could?
Yeah, essentially it was TV rights money because, contrary to what happens in the Premier League or in the Bundesliga, where the money from the television is almost equally shared, or at least there's a really relationship between what the money the club gets and the position they end in the final of the league season. In Spain, that doesn't happen. So during the 1990s, there was no centralized TV rights. So each club would get a sum of money from the TV companies directly negotiating with them. So if you had a first division team, you could bargain a price. If you had a second division team, you would bargain a very much smaller price. And then eventually, if you were a third or fourth tier team, you wouldn't get no money at all because nobody was really interested. And probably those matches was only seen locally on televisions. So essentially, what was the period called Liga de las Estrellas, the League of Stars in the mid 90s, was when the private owned TV companies, kind of replicating what happened with the Premier League, started to go digital and started to get every single match to be on television. That didn't happen until the 1990s in Spain. Eventually, there was just a couple of matches that were televised during the week for during the 1970s, 1980s. In the early 90s, I think there were three or four, but eventually not more than that. And when we get to the mid 90s, then the private owned television company called Canal Plus, which was actually a French TV channel that owned at the same time PSG, they tried to invest in Spanish football and made it very popular for broadcasting every single match that was on display in every single week for the first and the second tier. But of course, they would directly go to the clubs. They would pay a determined sum if you were Barcelona, Real Madrid, of course. Then if you were Atletico Madrid or Valencia or Betis or Deportivo La Coruña or Seville, you get another. Then you just go down the ranks and until you get to the end of the bottom of the second division. And clubs basically depended on that money to sign players because the other income they got was from the socios, the club members membership, which was around, I think, €5 or €6 at the time, or the equivalent of €5 or €6 at the time. I would say like £4 or £5. So essentially, and the money from the ticketing, essentially. And we have the average of football stadiums in Spain is around 20,000 supporters, 25, I would say. So essentially, that was the only money they would got. But at the same time, if they wanted to compete against the big ones, against the Real Madrids and against the Barcelonas, they had to sign top players. We have also the time when the Bosman law was started to be applied. So essentially, a
Mm.
lot of people were trying to sign international players before after decades where they only could sign Spanish players and a couple of foreigners. So essentially, a lot of football clubs really tried to develop sporting projects that didn't ended up really well. So in the end of the 1990s, for instance, Atletico Madrid was relegated. This is the same Atletico Madrid that recently played two Champions League finals and won two La Ligas, and they were relegated in 1999 for bankruptcy. And Sevilla and Betis, who are two of the biggest sides in Spain, and Sevilla after that won seven UEFA Europa Leagues, and Betis won two cups. They were relegated as well around the same time. So this was something that was happening to absolutely everyone. People was just pouring money in sporting projects. If the project didn't work out, they would eventually be near of being bankrupt. Of course, in those cases, being so big as they are, there was never a danger of folding as a football institution. But the smaller clubs that did exactly the same, clubs like Salamanca, clubs like Logroñés, like Extremadura, like Badajoz, like Oviedo, there were clubs from smaller communities that if things went bad, they really went bad. So most of those football clubs that disappeared in the 2000s were clubs that had been in the first division or at least in the second division during the 1990s. So they got TV money, they started building projects, thinking that money would be coming in every single season. And once they got the drop, there were no possibility to recover that money from anywhere else. So essentially, they had much more expenses than income, and in the end, they didn't had no one interested in buy. So they just filed for bankruptcy, and that was it. The difference is that at the same time, things were happening similarly in Italy. For instance, we all know that Parma got refunded. We all know that Fiorentina had a similar issue, even Napoli a similar issue, Palermo had a similar issue. But in Italy, what happens is that when you get relegated and folded by bankruptcy, just another businessman comes in, buys the club's license, and then kickstarts, even with a different name. But they then buy back the institutional rights to use the previous name or the previous crest, and everything goes to normal. And supporters simply kept on supporting the same football club. What happened in Spain is that for the few cases that some entrepreneurs, some local businessmen tried to buy a license to revitalize the club, most supporters were against. So you have cities where the club was folded for bankruptcy, like Salamanca, or like Logroñés, or like Jerez, or like Tarragona, and those cities now have two football clubs. You have the football club from the local entrepreneur who decided to buy the heritage of the previous football club and buy a license to compete, that is supported by almost no one, basically. And you have the football clubs that were Phoenix ideas from local supporters who said, no, if this went bad because we had people running the club that weren't us. And we were used to run our own clubs for decades, and nothing like this ever happened. So we can only guarantee our future if we take the realms under our own hands and if we decide to do what we want to do with this football club. So speaking, because I travel around Spain for the book, and I spoke directly with many of those people involved in this project, they always say the same thing. This football club that we have now, it's a tribute to the club that we had before, but at the same time, it's been run like we have wanted that our previous club was run, and it wasn't in the end, and that's why they folded. So for this clubs like Unionistas from Salamanca or like SD Logroñés, the important thing is just to get to the end of the year without debts. They prefer to get to the end of the year without the risk of disappearing altogether, and then to just go into a bigger division, and then it's too big for them, and then you are in the risk of folding because you don't have the ability to compete there. So they are very, um, I would say, happy to play in the third and the fourth tier for the time being because they know they can afford that. They know that playing in those tiers with those kinds of rivals, with the costs that playing in those divisions have, they can afford it. But they know if they go to the fully professional leagues, then you have to increase your budget big time. And for club member football clubs, it's very hard to get investors to comply on what they want the club to be and to keep the control of what will happen to their football clubs. So they are very comfortable, and I think the community is as well, because they are more happy enjoying the experience of being all together again, just seeing a football match, than try to aspire to compete with the big names in the leagues, to lose, to then get folded again, and then kickstart in a couple of years with another Phoenix club. They're not interested in that.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, again, this is kind of what makes it so fascinating for me. And you've actually answered a lot of the questions that I had for you, and touched on a lot of really important points. I suppose, first of all, to kind of come back to something that you said a little bit earlier on, what's interesting for me, and something that's been spoken about on this show before, is that a lot of the people who found these clubs, they acknowledge that they are a tribute, which I think is a very good way of putting it, to the football club whose history and heritage is legally owned by someone else
Mm.
that they don't want anything to do with. But this is where a dynamic for me comes into play, and bringing some kind of aspects of heritage and identity in it as well, is that the fans who you could argue, and I would say are the true drivers of a club's identity and heritage, they're taking it into their own hands instead of letting it be led by someone else. So within that, are they creating a new club and carrying the heritage on from that, or are they abandoning the heritage of the former club? Well, not really, because that club is now owned by someone that has nothing to do with the club, who is just looking to drive them into the ground. And ultimately, yes, you can leave trophies behind. Yes, you are leaving silverware and history behind, but you're then taking your heritage with you and putting it into a new vehicle, which is this new Phoenix club. So there's all these different kind of interests and dynamics and kind of complex dynamics at play here as well. But one thing that I did want to ask, see, these clubs that reform, is there a reason that they're concentrated around the third and fourth tiers? I think you kind of answered that as well. And again, it's really, really interesting, because a lot of these clubs, as you mentioned, they don't want to hit the heights of the professional divisions just yet, or at all, because they're quite happy with how their club is. They're quite happy with what they've got and what they've created, which is completely understandable. And it's, again, coming back to, talking about FC United and Manchester, like you said earlier, it's offering an alternative football. It's offering something different to professional football and what people would call modern football. But at what point then, and this is us going off on a little bit of a tangent, but I'm curious, at what point then do things start becoming a little bit unofficially split between the leagues, where you've got this sort of concentration of fan-owned, community-centric football clubs within tiers 3 and 4 who don't really want to progress through the leagues, and then you've got the professional tiers? At what point do we start talking about there potentially being a divide or a split in the leagues, is what I'm asking.
Well, essentially, we can grab that point in three different parts. I think there are football clubs who aspire to become fully professional, but they just don't want to do it yet because they don't think they have the means to, and they think there's a huge risk if they go full professional now. They always have a set of a path of how they would develop throughout the years, and most of them are football clubs with 10 to 15 years now. So essentially, they're in their infancies, really, despite having collected the heritage of the previous football clubs. They are just starting, so it's important for them to set the base For instance, I was talking with a member of one of those clubs, and he said, "We're getting this year the first graduate from the academy that when we started the academy in 2014, and now we finally get the first kids playing in the first team ever." So that kind of development, it's important to them because also focusing on grassroots makes them more close with the community, and they want to create projects that are more centered in what the region or the city is, not just so focused in just buying players and bringing players from other places inside of Spain or even foreigners. So to have a good competitive project, you need time, and especially if you're focusing on grassroots, that's one thing. And then, of course, there are the football clubs that are very comfortable to be where exactly they are because they believe that professional football is coming to a place that most people are trying to get away from. Essentially, because the over commercialization of the game, the costs of ticketing, the not be able to drink a beer in a football stadium, or the standing. There's a lot of issues regarding professional football that most supporters are getting fed up. So the possibility of supporting a football club in divisions that are not fully professional opens a way to revisit football like it was 20 to 30 years ago. And we know that we're living in a period of time where nostalgia is being on a whole-time high, I would say. So essentially, you get a lot of people just trying to be kids again. And the possibility to support a club in the third tier, go to the football match with your mates, standing, drinking a beer, seems much more interesting than just sitting on like a football stadium that looks like a supermarket, just watching for a match controlled by television schedules, and not being able to have a kickoff at 12 but having a kickoff in the night. So a lot of different realities within the professional game that are not appealing to much of the supporters of these football clubs. So they are not desperate to re-enter in that reality. And then also you have the divisions. Yeah, Spain is a very curious country in the sense that it's very big, very complex, and it's administratively divided in different regions. There are 17 different regions in Spain. So essentially what they have is they have two fully professional leagues with 20 clubs each. Then you have the third and the fourth tier who are semi-professional, and they have 44 football clubs in each one, divided in two zones, the north and the south. So essentially, what happens is that the champion of each zone gets promoted immediately, and then there's a playoff for the I think the best four of each one to fight for the other two places to go up to the second tier. So there's 44 teams just fighting to be part of from the third to the second division, and then you have the same equation from the fourth to the third tier. So in there you have around 130 football clubs. That's a lot of football clubs in those four tiers. And then after those 130 clubs that play, let's say, nationwide football, you have all the regional leagues. So it depends on the area you're at. The regional league can be extremely competitive or not. If you're in Madrid or in Barcelona, your regional league will be extremely competitive because there will be a lot of teams with huge budgets that are playing there because they have the economic capacity to do that. But if you are from the region of these smaller clubs, these Phoenix clubs, from the interior of Spain, where they are largely inhabited, where there are not a lot of big cities. Most of the regions are two cities above 20,000 inhabitants, and then small cities between 5 and 20,000, and then smaller cities even. So essentially, those regional leagues are very easy for a project that is sustainable. So these clubs started there, but they got promoted to the fourth and the third tier real quickly because in their region they were competing almost against amateur sides basically. So it was easy for the Unionistas in Salamanca in their region, or Logroñés in their region, or Seares in their region up north, or Taraco from Tarragona in their region to just get to the National League. Because essentially what happens is that when you win your regional league, you get promoted to the fourth tier. And that, in a sense, makes it easier for some to get there and harder for others. So that's why there's no amount of Phoenix related clubs in Madrid and Barcelona as big as you have in other regions. So that explains why, for instance, those football clubs with 10 years of lifespan have been able to reach the third or the fourth tier and have been able to keep themselves there. Because even if they get dropped to the regional league, they will get up immediately again because their projects are very sustainable and they're competing against much smaller sides who are very comfortable of competing in the amateur leagues, and some of them don't even want to go up because the huge jump regarding budget from the regional league to a national league is big. Spain is a very big country, so sometimes you have to travel. If you're from a regional league, I would say, for instance, in Valencia, which is in the coast of the Mediterranean, but you have to play in Galicia, which is in the other side of Spain, and you're in the same area, you have to catch up a flight. And probably most of those football clubs playing the amateur don't have the ability to pay 30 tickets for a squad to travel to Galicia. And they don't want to do a traveling by bus because it's like 16 hours drive from one side of Spain to the other. So some of them would say, okay, I'm very comfortable being the regional leagues. I'm very comfortable competing against my neighbors here. I don't have no expectations to go up to the national leagues. And these Phoenix clubs do have that expectation. But at the same time, I think among their fan base, there are a lot of people who say, no, football, professional football is starting to be rubbish and we just want to enjoy ourselves, enjoy our community. So if you don't want to go up to the second, we are not going to demand that as a football fan. We're just going to enjoy the moment we're living in.
Yeah, I think that's quite important, and we mentioned it on our episode with FC United of Manchester, where I kind of said to the guys, like, there's a lot to be said for clubs like we're talking about right now, where, you know, not everything, and yes, don't get me wrong, silverware and winning trophies is part of football, and you could argue should be the primary purpose of a football club. You know, you can also argue otherwise, but there's a lot to be said for not being in a rush to chase success as quickly as you can and burn yourself out too quickly. There is a lot to be said in that, and it is part of this wider theme of football clubs shifting more towards this kind of, community model. Again, like the clubs that we're talking about as well, which is really important.
There's a football club in Madrid. It was called Independiente Vallecas. You know, of course, Rayo Vallecano is probably one of the world's most well-known working class football clubs. They are very intertwined with their community, and Vallecas is a working class neighborhood in Madrid, very famous for their left-wing beliefs and very social projects. But Rayo Vallecano plays in the first division for over the last 30 years. They played in more than half in the first division and the other part in the second, so they are a professional club altogether, and they probably will play in Europe this season, and they already played in Europe once, so they are a project very interesting. Andoni Iraola, for instance, who is now manager from Bournemouth, was their previous manager. The current manager was his assistant, so essentially they are building a very interesting sporting project, but at the same time, they have an owner. And their owner is a guy who is totally opposite of the club's values. He just bought the club for a penny because the club was bankrupt. So you have the club supporters kind of fed up how he runs the club, but at the same time, they don't want to leave the club behind. But there was a group of supporters who were completely fed up with Presa, which is the owner. And so they founded a football club called Independiente Vallecas. Independiente means independence of Vallecas, to establish that they are still Rayo supporters. They still believe in the values of Rayo Vallecano. They just don't want to be part of the project while the guy is in charge. So essentially, their new football club plays in the regional league of Madrid because, like I said, it's much harder to go to the fourth or third tier if you're playing in Madrid. But they are a football club that are using this project not to climb divisions up, not to fight for silverware, but to help people out. So essentially, when they have football matches, they don't charge for tickets if you take food to give to the poor people of Vallecas. They played recently a match against Clapton FC, and all the ticket selling was sent to people who were in need of housing. So essentially, they use the game. They have hired a football player who was a refugee from Palestine. So basically, and they had a kit drawn like the Palestine flag just to support the Palestine cause with when all the things in Gaza started a year ago. So they are very connected with social and political projects, and they think that that's what the football club is all about. They really don't care if they play in the third regional league of Madrid, the second, the first, or the fourth tier. That's not important to them. The importance is to help out their neighbors through economic selling of tickets, selling of merchandise. At the same time, having players that some of them are simply refugees, so they get connected. Help with women around the area to enter their women's team at the same time, so they can have a place to be, especially women that are victims of machist violence, which is a great issue in Spain regretfully. So essentially, that's also one of the reasons that Phoenix clubs exist in the lower tiers. People that simply look at football as a way to help out the community, not looking for the honors, not looking for the silverware, not looking for the grandstand stadiums, but looking for a way to be like it was 80, 100 years ago, where football clubs were essentially a way of people getting together around a common passion they had. Again, the passion expression here, and to enjoy themselves while they were competing against their own neighbors, trying to see who was best, but with no grander expectations of becoming the very best in the world.
Yeah, that's what's great about it as well, though, is that it's the recognition that football clubs can do so much more for your community if that's how you want it to be. And if you want your football club to be community centric, to do all these things for people who are repressed, people who are, the least fortunate in society, then you have the ability to do it. And this is what clubs like this do. It shows that a model can be created where it's possible to centre the football club within a community in a way that benefits everyone. And again, it comes from this idea, and you mentioned there the issues with travelling across the country, and it's something that happens in Scotland as well. A lot of clubs that are in what would be known as the former junior leagues, technically, effectively Scottish non-league, they don't really want to progress any further than what is now Tier 6 because the costs involved with it would be too much, or the costs involved with improving their stadium are too much for it. But they're also quite happy with just being where they are because these junior football teams for a while were so community centric. Anyone who wanted to play football would go through them first and then they would move on. They're doing initiatives within the community. I mean, Motherwell, I know that they're not a junior club, they're professional, but they hold events for refugees who are being rehomed in Motherwell so that they can help introduce them and meet people within their new communities. Do you know what I mean? This is what football clubs, in my opinion anyway, should be for. And it's what's interesting about the kind of ambitions and the ideals that these guys have. And, I think Independiente Vallecas is a great example. So Independiente Vallecas is one of them. But what about some of these clubs who have went bust and have been reformed and are actually, could one day be at odds with the clubs that they split from or were formed from?
Yeah, essentially, I think there are two clubs that best represent that. They are joint clubs in the end. They present. There's an organization in Spain called Clubes de Accionariado Popular, which means there's a group of the football clubs that are Phoenix club-owned football clubs. They got together, they form an association, so they help out one another. When they are in the same tier, when they play to one another, they always have a special event for kids, for families. The travelings are supported between one and the other clubs. So essentially, it's a community within the community of Spanish football.
Brilliant. So there's a whole network, which I think is just terrific.
Yeah, and fandom is really really present in those gatherings and in those events, and when they play against it, it's generally a football party, and they help out one another when they are in need. So that sense of community helps, and I think the two clubs that most represent the core values of what those football clubs are in Spain are Unista Salamanca and SD Logroñés. Well, both came from football clubs that were in the first division in the 1990s. So Salamanca, of course, is one of the biggest cities in Western Spain. They were known because they had one of the first universities in the Iberian Peninsula. They're a city most well known for their authors, for their philosophers, teachers. Still today, there's a place where a lot of foreign students come to study because of the Erasmus project. So essentially, it's a place full of youth, but in an area of Spain where almost nobody lives because most of the area around Salamanca is just field where there are having just crops and animals passing by. So essentially, it's an area like I think it's 70 to 80 miles from the border with Portugal. So they represent a different way of being Spanish, more traditional, I would say. But at the same time, having such a youth from different places makes it also a very interesting city. So Salamanca was a football club that in the 1970s, for the first time, reached the first division. The star player was a guy called Vicente del Bosque, with most people who have followed football over the last 25 years. It's a name they will know because he was the manager of Spain World Cup side winning team in 2010 and he won to Champions League with Real Madrid. So Del Bosque is from around and was a local player. He was so good that Real Madrid signed him when he was still a teen. And that team of Salamanca played in the first division for a couple of years. Then they were dropped to the second tier. Nothing really odd happened because they were historically a second tier team. So normal day as usual. And in the 1990s, a guy called Juan Malillo, who people who follow Manchester City will surely know who he was because he's the assistant manager of Pep Guardiola, who was also a very young, promising manager and took up the team it first started to deploy what we now know today as 4-2-3-1. It was the first time in history that a manager started to play in that tactical system. We practically invented it. So Salamanca became like a laboratory for his ideas, and it worked so well that they got promoted to the first division once again, and they stayed there for a couple of seasons as well during the mid 90s, competing at. I would say they got mid-tables positions for a couple of seasons, and they got to drop at the end of the decade, and then eventually, like we said before, the economic situation of the club had them dissolved for bankruptcy at the end of the 2000s. So essentially, what happened next is that a local entrepreneur bought the idea of the original football club, tried to develop a local project around it, but a group of club members decided otherwise. So they founded a football club called Unionistas. Unionistas basically says union. So it's like the idea of the community uniting themselves around the football project. Del Bosque is now a club member of Unionistas as well. So he got attached with the project. He gave his blessing, I would say, to the project, which was also very good. They couldn't play in the former stadium of Salamanca because they didn't own it, so they got a new stadium for themselves. But they have a very curious idea. They control the number of club members that they have because they don't want the club to be growing up too fast. So they have now between 4 to 5 thousand club members, but there's a queue of people waiting in line to be accepted as club member. And the idea behind is that they have a stadium only for 5,000 people. So we don't want more club members than the seats we have in our stadium because we want every single club member to be able to attend football matches. So when we move to a bigger stadium, then we can amplify the number of club members. But for now, we just want everybody to feel they are part of something, they can be here. And at the same time, they are probably the best run football club in Spain regarding club member own. Every single year, club members choose the kit template they're going to wear for the next season. They decide on general assemblies which companies can sponsor them or not. They were invited by many betting companies to be their supporters, and they denied. They didn't want anything to do with the betting world. They wanted their shirts to be connected with local companies from the area to reinforce that sense of belonging. And they are in the third division now. They've been there for a couple of seasons. People tip them as to be the first club member-owned club to go to the second tier. And at the same time, they are an international club as well because they became famous in the mid 2010s. They were drawn against Real Madrid and Barcelona in the cup. They play really well, so people got notice of them, as things do in Spain when you have to play the big two of Barca and Madrid. And there was a time when the league decided that if the clubs wanted to compete in the third tier, they had to have football field of grass. They were playing in synthetic grass, and they had to be fully grass. And they couldn't afford it. They couldn't afford the changes in the stadium, so they were ready to fold to the fourth tier. And the story came out in the press, so they got help from a lot of people from outside of Spain, especially from the UK, but also from the United States, Australia, who contributed economically so they could install the turf. So
Fantastic.
that made him a very interesting and international project, and a very well beloved project around the world. And I think they are the great example of how club can be run by their club members, have a sustainable identity, at the same time aspire to be something else. And Logroñés is another example. They are more of an elevator club, a yo-yo club, because
Mm.
Logroño is a smaller city than Salamanca. There's also another club that got part of the heritage of their former club. Club Deportivo Logroñés was a football institution that got promoted to the first tier in the late 1980s for the first time ever in their history. They stayed for almost a decade in the first tier. They were a very hard competitive side. People used to say that they were the equivalent in Spain to do it on a Wednesday night in Stoke. So it was very hard to play there because of the weather, because of the stadium called Las Gaunas, which was a stadium very complicated to play at, especially for the big teams. There is always fully packed of supporters, muddy pitches, all those sorts of things you would expect from a club like that. They, like Salamanca, folded in the 2000s for bankruptcy. Like I said before, another football club emerged from that with a local entrepreneur, but the socios, the club members, decided otherwise. They said, we're going to do our own football club. They named him Sporting Deportivo Logroñés, and they were in the third tier last year when I was there visiting them. They dropped to the fourth tier, but now they are on their way up again to the third tier, so they are more of a yo-yo club. But at the same time, they are a football club that many people have learned to admire and respect, because like unionistas, they let the club members take most of the decisions regarding the kits they wear, the sponsors they get, and that makes people more connected with the idea of a club being part of the community. And also at the same time, they sponsor a lot of youth teams. So essentially, they also try to bring as much as possible graduates from their academy to the first team, to keep that spirit of Logroño as a city and as a region, La Rioja region, which is well known worldwide because of their wines, to be represented on the pitch whenever they play. And Unionistas, they change almost every single season the kit, but Logroñés always plays with the same kit of the former Logroñés side, as a way to pay those respects, those tributes to the former football club. And if you go to a match and you see in the stands, you see people wearing the new kits, but also people wearing the kits of the side of the 1980s and 90s, mixing all together. And it's a very beautiful experience to get.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's how you properly like marry what you had previously with what you have now, and that this is why I love these clubs that spring up as fan owned and fan founded and whatever else, is that they're not saying that. Well, and don't get me wrong, in some cases they do want to be a separate entity depending on the context, but for the most part, if their club has went defunct, they want to remember the old club as what it was, because at the end of the day, the supporters are the people who are continuing the memory of the club and keeping it alive. And yeah, it's brilliant how you get this kind of marriage of the old with the new, and people show up in the old kits, and they still acknowledge that, you know, this former football club is still part of who we are and part of our history. Yeah, it's just a great atmosphere. That's what I really like about it as well. It was the same with Hereford, Aldershot, Chester as well when we spoke with those guys. So yeah, it's a nice little sort of theme that kind of underpins all the discussions we have about fan-owned Phoenix clubs in particular. And I suppose one of the most well-known examples that I would probably say is Xerez Deportivo,
Hmm.
who of
Yeah.
course were founded after Xerez CD went bust in 2013.
Yeah, exactly. Jerez was also a first division side in the early 2000s. Jerez is a city in the Andalusia, in the southern part of Spain, well known for the circuit, where usually MotoGP goes there every single year. It's very iconic for motorbike lovers. And essentially, it was also a football club, very connected to the local community, that got folded, and then the supporters just decided to kickstart a new project, and they're also trying to get up and trying to establish themselves in the third, fourth tier. And you also have the extreme case of the Club Acenariado Popular of Murcia. Murcia is a region in the Mediterranean between Andalusia and Valencia, probably the place where most of Spain's best indie rock band comes from, which is very curious. Over the last few years, there's been a lot of musical acts coming from Murcia. And essentially, what happened to them is that the owner of the club they had before, simply moved to Granada, which is a city in Andalusia, which is like 200 miles away from Murcia. So he simply
Hmm.
did what Wimbledon suffer with Milton Keynes, basically, but with a bigger distance even. So essentially, they simply didn't lost their football club. They saw the football club convert in something else completely. So they kickstarted a project, also a club-based project, who is also competing now in the regional leagues, trying to get up to the national leagues. And at the same time, they still represent the same core values as Unionistas and Logroñés and Tarraco as well, from Tarragona, which was a group of supporters that were fed up on how the club of Tarragona Gymnastic, who plays in the third tier but used to play in the first and the second tier, has been run. Even Seares from Asturias, which is a small town on the outskirts of Gijón, who at the same time decided to create that club to keep that grassroots spirit well alive. And eventually, you have all those football institutions that come to represent much more than just a football club. They really represent back to basics, in a sense that they put fandom first, they put the community first, and they put the sporting goals in third or fourth place in their list of priorities. And that's something that people who watch football, who just don't want to see their side winning the Champions League, they just want to enjoy themselves. It makes them very appealing to just go there, watch a match, enjoy of their successes, support them when they need. And that's something I've learned with my travelings, and we're talking with these people, how they really committed with the idea of football club being an idea that makes them sustainable, not only economically wise, but emotionally as well. Because, of course, if you just try to do what the previous owners did with their former clubs and to be ambitious and to invest in winning, you don't know what you could win. Because eventually, if you are in a country like Spain, you know you're not going to win the league. That's something that only Barcelona, Madrid, and eventually Atletico or some other club can do that. So you're probably not even going to Europe. So what do you want to do? Essentially, you want to be in the first tier to be 12, 14, 15. That's your really ambition, or you want to be close to your community. You want to take part in something much more bigger than just being a first division or even a second division side. So these supporters decided they wanted to do something for their communities through football. And that's for me what is the greatest asset of this club-based football clubs.
I completely agree with you. And there's so many aspects as a supporter to it as well. Like you said, wanting to go to a different kind of football, a football that's more locally based. I wrote about this for our own website, following my local team, who are Tier 8 of Scotland. Very small club. They struggle to break 100 spectators per game, but it's everyone that's there because they're from the same place that you are. It's cheap, it's affordable. I can get entry and my lunch basically for £10, which you'll be hard pressed to find that anywhere else. But also there is a bit of a feel good factor attached to it because you're supporting local. You're giving a little bit back to these football clubs who have been part of your community for however long. And I can imagine it's the same for these guys as well. And because they've got so many social initiatives and plans attached to it as well, there's also that aspect to it. It's really nice. And I like to think and that our listeners will know what these clubs are all about because, like you mentioned with the Independiente Vallecas, they've got these relationships with the likes of Clapton. Dulwich Hamlet, I know, play a lot of friendlies with similar clubs like this as well. So there is this growing network of football clubs that we can actually point to and say, these guys are the model that a lot of our teams should be following and should be doing. And I wish a lot more clubs at a higher level could do, but I also appreciate that that's a little bit of a pipe dream because modern football and whatever else we've been over that many times. But I think what's important is that for Spain and where Spanish football is concerned, these small fan-owned Phoenix clubs are actually now etching themselves into Spanish football culture.
Yeah, and essentially, for instance, when people knowing that I wrote the book and knowing that I've been living in Spain for so many years and know the culture and know the nation and the football identity. Sometimes they ask me for tips for ground hopping, and people expect the usual, just go to Seville or just go to Vigo or Bilbao or Valencia. And of course, those are all fine journeys, and you can really enjoy those football clubs and the football atmosphere in the stadium. But I always say, if you can, and if you are going to do that, but you can spare the day or you can spare the time, try as well one of these football clubs. Try as well a trip to Salamanca or to Logroño or to Jerez or to Murcia. Try and experience this because in the end, we all know that first division football is very competitive. Now it's much more driven by tactics or by managers, very focused on what television is all about, controlling the scheduling of matches and everything, the marketing, everything is super expensive, the ticketing, to eat in the stadium, not being able to drink a beer, having to stay seated in while you want to be standing. So you have all those conditionants that tarnish a little bit of your experience when you go to those football matches. But then if you move a couple of divisions down on the football pyramid, you still find quality football. You still find stadiums that are all right, I would say. Stadiums that you see, they are in some cases even better than the stadiums in the second tier, probably. And you have that extra, that is the atmosphere that these clubs are able to gather, because in a sense, as they represent the community, people are much more interested. The ones who are there are much more interested to enjoy the experience. If you go to a first, second division club, you have probably a lot of tourists, you have probably a lot of supporters that are just there because they need to be there, but they probably are not as passionate because they are used just to the normal self. Imagine if you are a supporter, let's say from Getafe, which is a club from Madrid, and you're going to play like Atletico Madrid, Barcelona, and you're expected to lose, then you're just going to see a match where your side is expected to lose. And probably that happens with most people in the first, most supporters in the first tier of Spanish football, because of course, when you play with some sides, you're on the losing end most of the times. But then when you go to see these football clubs, they don't care if you win or lose. They probably will lose, but in some cases they will win, and when they do, it's fantastic. And when you see the videos that are posted on social networking of how fans just enlighten the stadium, and when they play away matches, they go with the team and they create the away end a spectacular atmosphere like Unionistas or Logroño supporters usually do, then you know they are there for more than just the wins and the losses. And that's probably one of the part that made us feel in love with football in the first place, because now we are football fans and football supporters for a lot of reasons at this moment in our lifetime. But we always started from the same point. We just wanted to have fun. We just wanted to enjoy. And that is applicable to when you played with your mates, and that's also applicable when you started to see matches in the ground with someone of your family or even your colleagues. And that feeling probably got lost in time, like what happens with so many things in life. And this kind of football clubs bring you back to that feeling, and that's a very interesting experience to relive.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think to kind of bring everything full circle, this is where Pasión comes into it again, because it's the feeling of going to a club knowing that you're contributing to something really special and enjoying it more so than you would than just and you know that this isn't to say that that this isn't to look down on the people who turn up for their clubs every single week and who live around their
Mm.
fixture schedules. We're not saying that you're not a true fan for not going to these clubs. That's not what we're saying. But what we're saying is sometimes if you are bored or getting too used to the run of the mill of what your club is going through week in, week out, go and see these clubs, because the guys who turn up to support these clubs week in, week out have so much more passion and energy and joy directed towards it, because when they win, it stands for something a little bit more. And I think this is what we're trying to say, is that these football clubs transcend just being about sports. It's about something different, and this is where the passion that these guys have had actually comes into play for the club, and how they contribute to this cultural phenomenon, because you can get so much more joy out of supporting a club that actually stands for something that's a little bit different. And I suppose that kind of leads us quite nicely on to the last part of the episode. In terms of longer term, how is it that we can actually look at this model and apply it to different football clubs where we are, Miguel? Because it's all well and good saying that we'd like to see this at clubs at a higher level, but it's not really doable at the top tier of football, is it? I actually think that part of what makes it special is that it's a bit further down the divisions, because if you bring something to the top tier like that, just by virtue of it being within the spotlight so much, everyone starts to replicate it because they know that it's popular, and then it stops being so special because it loses part of what it is.
Yeah. So picking up on what you said before, it's eventually not a question of judging fandom, because, for instance, myself, just to write this book, I went to see tons of football matches at different grounds for clubs in different tiers. So the experience is always different, and you have good things and bad things in everything. But I am a football supporter of a club that is expected to win the league every single season. So I know when I'm going to see a football match of my club that my nerves are if we win or if we don't win. It's more focus on results and less on belonging, because there are those kinds of clubs. Then there are the clubs that are more about competing, even if they don't win as often, but they want to believe that eventually one day they might. And those are probably the grosser football clubs that you find on the first tiers of many leagues and even in the second tier, because they expect to come up and just create that trend. And then you have the lower leagues, and you have the bottom of the football pyramid, where competing is not as relevant. And probably looking towards the future, I think the idea is that it depends on where football is going to. If the Super League model is already a reality in some aspects, even if not officially, then we already know that there's a closed door for many football clubs in the world to be part of that. And that's going to be an exclusive club for, I don't the Premier League clubs, because the money they have, the big clubs in Italy and Spain and Germany, some of the big clubs of Portugal, the Netherlands, Greece, Turkey. But eventually that will be it. And all the other nations and all the other clubs in the smaller tiers of those leagues will count absolute for nothing for the business part of the game, because people are not going to buy merchandise to see a football club in the second tier of France. Kids are not going to pick up their FIFA game and go and play with a second tier side in Spain. And eventually, only a few football nerds like ourselves will do a save in a football manager to rise to glory from the lower tiers of Romanian football, or whatever. But we know we are a minority. So essentially, if the game shuts down the door on these people, then it's legit for them to not be interested at all in the business. So I think the future will be much more related to this kind of project, and I think they will expand, not because of people just trying to copying the good side of it, but because more people will feel excluded from the game itself, from the decisions that are going to be made and already have been made by the economic side of the game, by the institutions that control our game, being the FIFA, the UEFA, even the football associations. So if those peoples eventually one day wake up and say, I don't want to belong to this because those people don't want me here. I'm not I'm a commodity to them. I'm not something they're going to get money out from. So they will start to look more to these smaller clubs. And I think it's a phenomenon that's already happening. Most of the people that are from Unionistas or Logroñés or Jerez, there are local people that are connected. But you have, for instance, in Barcelona, that there's a brilliant example. Over the past weekend, we had what is called the other derby of Barcelona, the popular derby of Barcelona between two football clubs who are called Europa and San Andreu, who are clubs from two different neighborhoods of Barcelona. They are very different from one another. They are rivals. They represent the same values of being connected with a neighborhood, but in different ways. And those matches are fully packed. And they are not only fully packed because they are clubs that belong to neighborhoods where a lot of people live, but most of all because most of the people that go to see those matches, the matches of Europa and Santander, who play currently in the fourth tier and both want to go to the third tier, and they are featured in the book as well, is that they are probably fed up with Barcelona becoming a multinational club. And the Barcelona that they grown to love, the club that was connected with the Catalan cause, with the city, is a little by little disappearing into becoming a multinational worldwide club. And the appeal of Support Barcelona is going fade by the day. The cost of going to see a match is unaffordable to many. The cost of buying a shirt for your son or for yourself, it's unaffordable to many. So in a sense that erodes the sense of belonging to the club. Of course, they always want Barcelona to win, and they probably, if there's a Barcelona Madrid, they will watch the game in tally and they will support. But at the same time, if they want to be part of something, they will look down on the football pyramid, and they will find those clubs. And in Barcelona, Europa, and San Andreu are great examples, and they're being very successful exploring that. People who are connected with those clubs told me that a lot of supporters came over the last few years, and they were well-known Barcelona supporters within the community, and they simply said, I will stop spending my money only in Barcelona. And I need to be more connected with the game, and this is the best option. So that will happen in other cities as well. People will get fed up, and it's very curious. Just to close the, like you said, the circle, is that we are talking about football clubs that were Phoenix clubs, reborn clubs of clubs that have folded. We are talking about clubs, most of them from cities of the interior, but the first football club owned in Spain, the first Club Accionariado Popular, was actually a group of supporters of Atletico de Madrid that were fed up and tired of how the club was run. And in 2007, they started the Club de Socios Atletico Madrid. And this was the first one of all the projects that came after. So, in a sense, they were already 20 years ago uh, predicting how the future would be. More people getting fed up of how the big clubs are being run, and look for an answer below in the football pyramid. And that answer can be a club they already created that tries to represent what they would want their club to be. It could be a Phoenix club of a football club that exists no more and they want to pay a tribute, or even can be a football club that was already there but was not well supported, and then they decided to enroll in the cause and start to go to matches and start to be more part of the football club and help that club to grow. We have all those kinds of different examples in Spanish football pyramid. I think that's the way the game is going to be, because all of them know they will not be able to play a match against Real Madrid, Barcelona, and win. All of them know they will not be able to win the cup or the league or play Champions League football or play the Europa League. So they are very okay with that reality, and probably they will have a different club to support in those cases. Probably they will go and see a match on a Sunday afternoon, and then on the Sunday night they will be cheering for Real Madrid or Barcelona or Atletico or wherever. but the experience, the going to the grounds, the idea of belonging, I think with time it will be much more bigger in these club fan based institutions than with the traditional way of clubs being run in the first and the second tier in Spanish football.
Yeah, I mean it's hard to disagree with you, to be completely honest with you, and I think in many other nations we see this shift taking place as well. England probably obviously the one that people will know the most, because you've got Dulwich Hamlet, you've got Clapton, you've got all these other clubs that have sprung up, Aldershot, Chester that we mentioned earlier, but there's so many others that are coming up in other nations, and I think one of the takeaways from this, not just this recording but also this wider theme that we're talking about, is that there are football clubs out there that can offer you that alternative, and you don't need to look very far to find them. Even if it's just a case of walking out your door and going down to your local team to even give you a taste of it, then that's what you need to do. And I like to think that a lot of the episodes that we've recorded, especially this year, have kind of focused on that. And it's not really been by virtue of me intentionally seeking out guests who are going to speak about that, but it's just becoming ever more prominent. And I think this is something that is going to be a thread within your book as well. Obviously, at the time of recording, it's not out yet and I've not read it, but I think part of the point of it is to encourage people to at least check out this football alternative.
Yeah, totally. I think it's the right way to understand that another football is possible, another football is enjoyable, and you can still be supporting first tier clubs. You can be playing FIFA with your mates using the big time clubs, but at the same time, like you said, it's just open the door or open your window and see that another reality is possible, and the two can combine. I think in the end, we will live in a society where we have this idea of Super League existing in one way or the other, but at the same time you'll be having the other way of living as well, and you can be enrolled in both. You can be emotionally connected with a big club from wherever you're coming from, or if you had any family connected previously, or if you just like the shirt, or you just like how they represent the game. But at the same time, I think people will need, and after COVID, I think that went even higher, the idea of experience something of positivity, something that makes you feel alive. And probably these kind of football clubs all around Europe are, like you said, are springing over. And the idea of the people falling in love with the bottom of the football pyramids everywhere, it's a recognition of how people really feel the nostalgia of the past, but at the same time they just want to be part of something else in the future. And it's much more easier to be part of your local club or a club from your community than be part of a multinational that is a club that don't look at you as a supporter. They look at you as an asset. They look at you as a possible buyer of merchandise or a possible customer in the end. So I think we'll have customer clubs. We're always going to have the business part of the game, but if you want more the sense of belonging, then you still have these institutions that already exist. In Spain, the book mentions some, but there are many more. And I think if you go and if you're listening to this podcast and you come from different countries, you'll probably know examples from those countries as well. And it's just a question of just a little investigation on the net, and then you'll surely find the next football ground to visit. And then if you do it once, I think you will not repent and you want to do it again, because it will change completely the way that you think football is. And football is much more than just having a Champions League final with 100 people on the stands. It's much more than that. It has always been much more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I've not really got anything more to add to that. I think you've put it beautifully and hit the nail on the head, to be completely honest. It's been a great chat once again, Miguel. So thanks very much for joining us and coming on the show once again to talk about everything that you've been doing in terms of your traveling, in terms of your research, and in terms of writing your new book as well. I'm really looking forward to reading it. So just before we finish, do you want to talk a little bit more about your book that's by the time this episode is released, will actually be out?
Yeah, so Pasión, like we mentioned before, is a take on what football and Spain is all about. Is football is the excuse essentially to talk about Spain. There's a lot of football stories, of course, but also the parts of Spanish history, Spanish culture, Spanish gastronomy. So recommendations on where to go on vacation. We all know that Spain is a preferred destination for many in the UK and in Northern Europe. So that's also part of their own culture now. And essentially the book travels throughout the country with me visiting a lot of stadiums, watching a lot of matches, talking with a lot of people connected with the football clubs, with the supporters, but also talks about the importance, for instance, of football managers, Spanish football managers in current day football. The importance of the holding midfielder, the Spanish holding midfielder, which is a tactical position they almost made popular in the 1990s. And this season, with Rodri winning the Ballon d'Or, made like a recognition for the players like Xabi Alonso or Busquets that we all know from the past years. And also the importance of the press to create the sense of what Spanish football culture is all about, because it's a country, like we said, very passionate, and the press has a huge power, huge influence in how football is perceived. So it's also a chapter in there. And there's a chapter on like 6 or 7 different geographical regions, so you can get tips for ground hopping, tips for eating. So it's essentially, it's like you're journeying the country through football and mixing stories regarding football and stories regarding the people who live in there, and their sense of nation. And of course, as most people know, Spain is a very big country, a very complex country. There are different languages within Spain, different nations within Spain. So also that makes it very attractive if you're going to know more about what's been Catalan, what is being Galician or Basque or the traditional Spain. Everything is mixed up in there. And I think it's a very enjoyable read, and I hope people really like it.
Yeah, as I said, I'm looking forward to it. And of course, we'll put the links to your book in our show notes when it's released. Because, as I've said a few times now, at the time the recording the book is not out, but it will be out once we've released this episode, so all the information will be in the show notes. But Miguel, thank you very much for joining me once again to talk about some of the fascinating things that you've discovered in your footballing journey through Spain, and some of the things that we always love talking about on this podcast. Thank you to all of our listeners once again who've tuned in. I do hope you've been enjoying this run of shows that we've been on recently. They've been an absolute joy to record, and I've had such a great time speaking with everyone who's been on the show recently. Of course, if there is anything that you want us to cover, or if there's any questions that you want us to ask about this episode, please do get in touch. You can DM us on X at @_footballheritage, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk as well. For now, Miguel, say goodbye.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm looking forward to come back again with another excuse to talk about what we love most, that is football and football culture.
Yes, for the next book, or hopefully before then as well. It'd be a delight to have you back on, Miguel. Yeah. So thank you very much for joining us. For now, it's goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.